Folklore, horror, and sapphics. If your ears just went up like a dog, you're going to want to read this. I realised a little while ago that I did want to become a proper book reviewer, but then I was like, well, I've never done a proper book review, I don't have my voice out there, I don't have my opinions out there enough for people to listen to my book reviews. And then it dawned on me that I could just start, I could just pretend that I'm a book reviewer. So instead of going through all the awkward, like, this is my first book review, I'm just going to pretend that I'm a book reviewer, because to fall asleep, you must first pretend to be asleep. And that's the way of everything. I can't remember who said that, not me. So today I'm going to be reviewing We Call Them Witches by India Rose Bauer. Can we just take a moment for that really gorgeous, creepy, but beautiful cover? I love it. I picked up this book because I believed it to be a very folkloric dystopian, which it definitely is, but it's more horror than I realised, and I'm not a horror girly. I'm very easily spooked. Things play on my mind a lot, so I tend to stay away from scary things. However, I feel like this was tame for a horror, and that's coming from someone who hasn't read horror or doesn't watch horror, but it felt quite tame. So if you're a horror fan, it's definitely good. I don't know how much it's going to scratch that itch. So the plot of this book is about a family surviving after a world-ending apocalypse. Our narrator is Sarah, and she has a sibling called Danny, Danny's wife, someone, the mum, and two little twin girls, and then a slightly older but younger to the main character Sarah brother. Straight off the bat, one thing that I really enjoyed that I've not read before is a non-binary character. Shame on me for not having read that before. However, I feel like this was a really good first for me to read it, because it was incredibly normalized and it wasn't a point of conflict. It was mentioned between the characters, so like the mum, for example, there were a few times where she dead named them and things like that, but the story wasn't focused around their identity, which I liked, because it should just be normalised in books like this. So I really did enjoy that aspect. And also, there is sapphic representation with our main character, Sarah. It's not really discussed what she is, whether it's like bisexual or lesbian, it's just sapphic. She has feelings towards another woman in here. Now, I'm going to say a few things before I get into the spoiler territory, just so that you can get a feel of the book and then you can want to read it for yourself, maybe without spoilers. So the premise of this book is this family often move houses in this apocalyptic wasteland kind of space to avoid what they call witches, and they don't really know what they are. They're these kind of monsters, and they ward them off by doing very witchy like things, like setting up wards and things like that. They've just found a new house and they're settling in, and then a girl appears out of nowhere. They reluctantly take her in, and then soon after they take her in, the younger brother goes missing. The main character and everyone else pretty much is kind of thrust into this journey trying to get him back. Quickest summary of the plot that I can give without spoiling anything. I'm going to delve more into my opinions about it now, so I'm going to get into spoiler territory. So one of the good things I've kind of already mentioned, and it's the characters in there. So the non-binary character, Danny, I loved them, as well as our main character, who's sapphic. I did really like that. But just in general, like the family, the dynamics between these characters, I really did enjoy. I found them to be really nice to read and really compelling, especially since the main plot is obviously going to save a family member. The monsters in this I thought were very cool. They really reminded me of Annihilation, specifically the movie, because I've not read the book, so I don't know how different they are. However, if you've seen the film Annihilation, they really reminded me of that, in the sense that they kind of blended into their environment, which I thought was so cool. Definitely, I was scared at points, which again is why I say I didn't expect it to be a horror. I was scared at points. I expected it to be more kind of gothic and eerie as opposed to a horror. Another thing I really enjoyed was this post-apocalyptic lifestyle that they kind of showed. You get to see how they live, what they eat, things like that, and I really love that. That's personally one of my favourite things, and that's also what I write about in my book, so it's a little bit biased there. I felt like it really did a good exploration of life after the apocalypse, which is what I always search for in these kind of dystopian books. Now to get onto the parts that I didn't massively like. The writing style felt incredibly young, and it didn't bother me that much. It just meant that I flew through it very quickly. However, after like the first two chapters, I was sat there thinking, how old is this main character, this narrator? Because I couldn't decipher it, and I felt like she's described. See, I still don't even know. I think she's over 18. I don't know, because this was my impression was that this was an adult kind of horror dystopian novel, but it did feel very juvenile. Her narration felt very young, and it was a little bit hard at first. However, I didn't personally find it that much of an issue. I kind of got over it pretty quickly and accepted it. And if anything, it helped me read it a lot faster. Another thing is that it was a bit less folklore inspired than I was hoping. I was hoping for a lot more of a dive into folklore traditions and things like that, and I guess it kind of did in a way, but just not enough for me personally. This next point that I'm about to say, it's incredibly personal, and when I first finished the book, I was all guns blazing on this. I was like, I hate this, I didn't like it, this part really ruined it for me, blah blah blah. And then I sat on it for a minute and I went, actually, I think this is just the character, because obviously it's a first person narrator. I was like, okay, this isn't a fault of the author, this is just the way the character thinks and the things that they say. And I was like, okay, never mind, I'll ignore it. But then I was like, actually, I can't ignore it, and it does bother me. And even though it is the character and it's they talk this way because of the things that they've been through, it still really bothered me, and I couldn't get out of it. Although it did make sense for this book, but it's the pop culture references that the main character kept making. Again, it makes sense because they were old enough to understand these references, and then the apocalypse happened. So they're still kind of leaning on the references. However, me personally, I just don't like to read about that in a book, and I was under the impression that there wasn't going to be any of that. So when I went into it and kept encountering all these pop culture references, I didn't like it. Similarly, from that, again, this is just the character's voice, this is just who she is, but it really, really grated me. And it was, she kept saying, if this were a movie, this is the part where I'd, I truly, truly don't like that. So whoever is to blame, the writing style or just the character in general, maybe I just don't like the character. I really did not like that. I'm gonna quickly see if I can skim through and find the exact quote that made me think, yeah, I can't do this. Okay, I found the quote, and it is genuinely right at the end. Like, this is how close to the end it is. So at least I made it to the end without this bothering me. But if this was further to the start, I probably would have DNF'd. Our narrator goes, "If this was a film, this would be the scene where I whistle. Only I can't whistle, so I yell instead. Oi, dickface." She's fighting like this insane, otherworldly, alien, just disgusting, like shape shifting, grotesque, grim beast witch. So it really did pull me out. Like, I hate that in general. And it felt like a parody almost of like those really popular action films that do it. However, it wasn't a parody, I think it was being serious. And again, like, this is the character's voice, well, then I don't like the character. Another thing for me that I really didn't like is I was such a big fan of the sapphic romance in this, and it was not a happy ending. I suppose it makes sense, and it made the story altogether better and more chilling. However, I hate to see women betraying each other. Like, betraying each other without any kind of, where it circles around back into forgiveness and apologies. I don't like to see women get hurt by other women, especially girlfriends or like romantic partners. It broke my heart, the betrayal. I think what happened was the betrayal happens right at the end, and it distracted me and infuriated me so much that I kind of stopped paying as much attention as I should have in the rest of the end, so I didn't understand what was going on. And then in the last few pages, it kind of wrapped it up nicely, and I thought, oh, this is a very good ending. Bonus points for the ending because it was genuinely very good. It wrapped around in a very sad, devastating, and scary kind of way. However, I was just butthurt that the girls broke up. Essentially, they broke up. They had a really bad. It was like Charles and Eric on the beach scene in First Class. It was like that. Overall, I gave this book 3.25 stars, and it's because it did definitely have a lot of good to it. However, there were a few noticeable things that did pull me away from it, and therefore I won't give it more stars, because the way that I see it is, if I could read another book exactly like this with all the same kind of content, I wouldn't, because the pop culture references, the movie stuff, the unhappy ending between my girls, it did upset me, and I didn't like that. However, I am glad I read it because there was a lot of good in it that kept me going. I do recommend it, especially if you're a horror fan, because I think the reason I was so upset is because my expectations going into it were just different than what I got out of it. So that's why I feel like I didn't love it as much, because my expectations were more folkloric, dystopian, and sapphic. Those are my two expectations going in. The folkloric dystopian didn't massively meet my standards, and then the sapphic part had a very unhappy ending. So there you go, there's my very quick short review on We Call Them Witches. That's my little introduction to the book reviewing world. I hope this has given you some insight into the book. I hope you've, been informed on whether or not you should read it or not. I would say give it a go, especially if you're a horror fan, you're a post-apocalyptic fan, you're a monster fan. But if you do look for sapphic romances or more folkloric kind of witchy stuff, I would say this isn't for you. Let me know if you enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next one.